She was his boss, his rival, the woman he swore he could never tolerate, until the day he said it out loud in front of everyone. No man could ever live with someone as demanding as you. The room went silent, and then she looked at him and said 4 words that changed everything. You already do. Stay until the end, hit like, and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled. The conference room on the 31st floor of Ashcroft Media smelled like burnt coffee and panic. Nathan Cole stood at the head of the long glass table, his tie loosened, sleeves rolled to the elbow, staring at a slide deck that had been rebuilt 4 times in the last 6 hours. Behind him, the wall of windows showed Boston going dark, streetlights blinking on one by one like the city itself was getting impatient with him. "This isn't it," Victoria Ashcroft said, not even looking up from her tablet. "Slide 9. The tone is wrong." "The tone is wrong," Nathan repeated flat. "Victoria, we've redone slide 9 3 times today. Then we'll do it a 4th. He dragged a hand down his face. Around the table, 6 members of the strategy team sat frozen, eyes flicking between the 2 of them like they were watching a tennis match they desperately didn't want to be part of. Nobody at Ashcroft Media interrupted Victoria when she was in this mood. Nobody except Nathan. "You know what?" he said, and even as the words started coming, some small rational part of his brain was screaming at him to stop. "I don't think you understand how exhausting this is. You don't just have high standards, Victoria. You have impossible ones. You want a deck that doesn't just sell the client. You want it to be perfect art. There's a difference." Victoria finally lifted her eyes from the tablet. Calm, too calm. That was always the worst part. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. "Perfect art is what wins $300 million accounts, Mr. Cole. If that's exhausting for you, the door is right there." "That's not—" He exhaled hard, frustration boiling somewhere behind his ribs. Somewhere it had been simmering for 2 years now, ever since he'd taken this job and found out the brilliant, ruthless, untouchable owner of the company was somehow also 30 years old and somehow also impossible to predict. "I'm just saying, no man could ever live with someone as demanding as you. I mean that. I don't know how anyone could." The room went dead silent. Someone, it might have been Priya from the design team, actually set down her pen like the sound of it might detonate something. Victoria didn't blink. She set the tablet down on the table, slow, deliberate, the kind of slow that made grown executives sweat through their shirts in board meetings. She looked at Nathan for a long 3 seconds, long enough that he felt the heat crawl up the back of his neck, the kind of heat that came from knowing you'd said something you couldn't take back, the kind that came from an audience. "You already do," she said. Nobody breathed. Nathan opened his mouth, closed it. He genuinely did not have a response prepared for that, because 2 years of arguing with this woman over font choices and ad spend, and which agency in turn got promoted, had not once, prepared him for her to say something like that, in that tone, in front of the entire strategy team, 2 days before the biggest pitch of both their careers. That's not what he started. "Slide 9, Victoria said, already looking back at her tablet, voice perfectly level again, like she hadn't just dropped a live grenade into the middle of a budget meeting and walked away from it. "Fix the tone. We present to Bellwether in 48 hours, and I will not lose this account because the team got tired." The meeting ended 20 minutes later. Nathan didn't remember a single thing that was said in those 20 minutes. He remembered Victoria's face, completely unreadable, and the way she'd left the room first, heels clicking against the marble floor like punctuation at the end of a sentence she had no intention of finishing. Nathan didn't go home that night until almost 11. His apartment in Charlestown was small but warm, the kind of place that had been decorated mostly by a 6-year-old with strong opinions about where the unicorn stickers should go. He found his daughter, Emma, asleep on the couch, half covered by a blanket, an open coloring book splayed across her chest. His sister, Dana, who watched Emma on the late nights, was scrolling through her phone in the kitchen. "She wouldn't go to bed without you," Dana said quietly. "Said she wanted to show you the drawing." Nathan looked down at the open page. A lopsided house, 2 stick figures holding hands, a dog that was probably supposed to be a cat. He felt something in his chest loosen, just slightly, the tightness from the day starting to ease. Rough one? Dana asked, studying his face the way only a sister could. You have no idea. He carried Emma to her room, tucked her in, kissed her forehead, and stood there a minute longer than necessary, just listening to her breathe. This was the part of his life nobody at the office ever saw. The part where Nathan Cole wasn't the sharp-tongued strategy director who went head-to-head with the company's owner in front of the whole floor. He was just a dad. A tired, broke by Boston standards, single dad who'd been raising his daughter alone since Emma was 2, after her mother decided motherhood wasn't the life she wanted after all. He sat at the kitchen table after Dana left, a beer he wasn't really drinking sweating onto a coaster, and he kept hearing it. You already do. What the hell did that mean? Victoria Ashcroft's penthouse was on the 44th floor of a building she partially owned, with a view of the harbor that most people would have killed for and that she barely looked at anymore. She stood at the window with a glass of wine she hadn't touched, replaying the meeting in her head for the dozenth time. No man could ever live with someone as demanding as you. She'd heard worse. She'd been called worse. Ice Queen, robot, the B word so many times in board meetings that she'd stopped flinching at it around 26. None of it usually stayed with her past the elevator ride down. This one stayed. Maybe because it was Nathan. Maybe because in 2 years of working 12, 14-hour days next to him, arguing about creative direction and client strategy, and whether his gut feeling was a legitimate business metric, she had built an entire wall specifically reinforced against the possibility that his opinion of her could matter. And then he'd said that, in front of everyone. And something in her, something she didn't examine too closely, something that lived underneath the boardroom voice and the tailored blazers and the reputation she'd spent a decade building, had just reacted. Without permission, you already do. It wasn't even true. Not in the way it sounded. She didn't live with him. She barely knew what his apartment looked like. But it had felt true coming out of her mouth, and that terrified her more than anything Nathan had said. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A text from her assistant, Marcus. Bellwether moved up the timeline. They want final numbers by Thursday morning instead of Friday. Also, everyone on the 31st floor is talking about today. Just so you know. Victoria closed her eyes. Of course they are. The next morning, Nathan got to the office at 7, 2 hours before he needed to, mostly because he hadn't slept, and partly because he wanted to be at his desk, working, focused, not thinking about it, before Victoria arrived and the whole office turned into a minefield of sideways glances again. It didn't work. By 8:15, Priya had already stopped by his desk twice under the pretense of asking about font sizing, clearly fishing for gossip. By 8:30, the office group chat, the one technically meant for project updates, had exactly one new message from an account he was fairly sure belonged to someone in accounting. Did anyone else hear what Nathan said to Victoria yesterday? He muted the chat. At 9, Victoria's assistant Marcus appeared at his desk, looking apologetic in the specific way people looked when they were about to deliver news they knew would not be well received. She wants to see you. Her office. Nathan's stomach dropped, but his face didn't show it. 2 years of practice. Now? Now. He walked the length of the floor like he was walking to his own execution, very aware of the fact that every single person on that floor was pretending very hard not to watch him do it. Victoria's office took up the corner of the building, glass walls on 2 sides, a desk that probably cost more than his car. She was standing when he walked in, not sitting, arms crossed, looking at the Boston skyline like it owed her money. "Close the door," she said. He closed the door. "I want to address yesterday," Victoria said, turning around. Her face was composed, professional, every inch the CEO. But there was something underneath it, a tightness around her eyes that hadn't been there before. "What I said. It was unprofessional, and it shouldn't have happened in front of the team." "Victoria, let me finish." Her voice had an edge now, sharper, like she needed to get through this before she lost her nerve. "What you said was also unprofessional. We are going to pretend it didn't happen, both of it, because in 46 hours we are standing in front of Bellwether's board trying to convince them to give us their entire North American rebrand. And I am not going to let," she paused, searching for the right word, "whatever that was yesterday cost this company $300 million. Nathan nodded slowly. "Agreed. Good. Neither of them moved. For what it's worth, Nathan said, because apparently he had not learned a single thing from the previous day's disaster. I am sorry for what I said. It came out wrong. I don't actually think... I do think you're demanding. You are demanding, but I didn't mean it the way it sounded. Victoria's jaw tightened. And how did it sound? Like I was complaining about something personal, which I wasn't. This is work. We argue about work. We've always argued about work, Victoria said, and there was something almost wistful in the way she said it, like she was reminding herself. We have. So why did it feel different yesterday? The question hung there between them, too honest, too unguarded for either of them to have actually meant to say it out loud. Victoria looked almost startled at herself. Nathan didn't have an answer, or rather, he had one, and it scared him enough that he wasn't about to say it in her office 2 days before the biggest presentation of his career. I don't know, he said instead, which was technically true and also a complete lie. Victoria nodded once, sharp, like she was filing the moment away somewhere she didn't intend to revisit. Slide 9 is fixed? Fixed. Good. I want a full run through it too. We need this perfect, Nathan. There it was. Nathan, not Mr. Cole. She rarely used his first name in the office. He noticed it the way you notice when someone changes the lighting in a room without telling you why. It will be, he said, and left before either of them could say anything else they weren't ready to say. The 2 days before the Bellwether presentation passed in a blur of caffeine, late nights, and a strange new tension that the entire 31st floor could feel, but nobody dared name out loud. Nathan and Victoria worked the same hours, sat across the same tables, fought over the same slides, but something had shifted. The fights had less heat in them now, more care, like two people who'd accidentally shown each other something true and were now both trying to act like they hadn't. The morning of the presentation, Nathan arrived at the office in his best suit, the navy one Emma had picked out for him at the store because she said it made him look like a superhero, but for boring grown-up stuff. He'd laughed at the time. He thought about it now, standing in the elevator, watching the floor numbers climb, his tie suddenly feeling too tight. Victoria was already in the conference room when he walked in, dressed in deep emerald, hair pulled back, looking every bit the billionaire businesswoman the press loved to photograph in fear. But her hands, when he looked closely, were gripping the edge of the table just slightly too hard. "You're nervous," he said, surprised at himself for saying it. "I'm never nervous." Victoria. She looked at him, and for just a second, the wall came down. "This account changes everything for us. If we lose it, we're not going to lose it. You don't know that." "I know we don't lose," Nathan said, and he meant the we, and judging by the look on her face, she heard it that way too. "Whatever's happening between us right now, and I don't even know what to call it, it doesn't change the fact that we're good at this, together. We always have been." Victoria studied him for a long moment. "Even after what you said?" "Especially after what you said back." The corner of her mouth almost moved. Almost. "Let's go make them regret ever doubting us," she said, and walked out the door first, the way she always did. Except this time, just before she crossed the threshold, she glanced back at him. Just once. Just long enough. Pumbebs. The Bellwether boardroom was on the 40th floor of their building 3 blocks away, all dark wood and old money, 6 executives seated around a table built to intimidate people exactly like Nathan and Victoria. The CEO, a silver-haired man named Richard Bellwether, did not smile when they walked in. Nobody on his side of the table smiled. "You have 20 minutes, Bellwether said. Make them count." What followed was, by every account that mattered, the best presentation either of them had ever given in their careers. Victoria opened with the numbers. Sharp, fast, undeniable, the kind of data that made skeptical executives lean forward in their chairs. Then Nathan took over, walking them through the creative vision, the emotional core of the campaign, the story they wanted to tell about a 100-year-old company finally stepping into the next century. And then, this was the part neither of them had planned, the part that happened almost by instinct. They started finishing each other's sentences. Victoria would set up a point, and Nathan would land it. Nathan would raise a concern, and Victoria would answer it before he'd even fully asked. It wasn't rehearsed. It was something closer to muscle memory, 2 years of arguing and building and tearing down ideas together, finally clicking into something seamless. Bellwether's expression, by minute 15, had shifted from skeptical to something close to impressed. "This is," he said when they finished, looking between the two of them. "I have to admit, I expected a pitch. This felt more like watching two people finish each other's thoughts." "That's what 12 years in this industry does to a partnership," Victoria said smoothly, and Nathan had to fight not to react to the word partnership, the way it landed differently than it would have a week ago. "We'll have our decision to you by end of week," Bellwether said. "But off the record, that was the strongest pitch I've seen from anyone this year." They didn't speak in the elevator down. They didn't speak walking the 3 blocks back to the office, the late afternoon sun cutting hard across the Boston skyline, both of them still riding the adrenaline of a presentation that had gone better than either of them had dared to hope. It was Victoria who finally broke the silence, standing outside the building, neither of them quite ready to walk back into the office and the inevitable questions waiting there. "We were good in there," she said. "We were better than good. I don't know how to explain what happened. The way we—" She stopped, frustrated with herself for not finding the words, which Nathan had never once seen happen in 2 years of working with her. "I think I do," Nathan said quietly. "I think it's the same thing that happened Tuesday, in the meeting. When I said that thing I shouldn't have said, and you said the thing you definitely shouldn't have said." Victoria's eyes met his, guarded but not closed. "You think there's something underneath all this fighting. I think there's been something underneath all this fighting for a long time, and I think we've both been too scared or too stubborn to look at it directly." She didn't answer right away. The wind off the harbor pulled a strand of hair loose from her ponytail, and she tucked it back with a hand that wasn't quite steady. "I have a 6-year-old daughter who thinks I'm a superhero because I wore a nice suit," Nathan said, half laughing at himself, trying to break the tension before it became something neither of them could take back. "And you own half this city. We don't exactly make sense, Victoria." "No," she agreed. "We don't. So maybe we just go back to work. Pretend this week didn't happen. Go back to arguing about font sizes." He watched something flicker across her face. Disappointment, maybe, quickly hidden behind the same composed mask she wore in every board meeting. "Maybe," she said, but neither of them moved. They stood there on the sidewalk a moment longer than the conversation called for, both of them clearly waiting for the other to say something different, something braver, and neither of them quite finding the nerve. "I should get back," Victoria finally said. "Marcus has 6 fires that need putting out." "Right. Of course." She started walking, then stopped, turning back just enough to look at him over her shoulder. "Nathan." "Yeah?" "You were right, you know, what you said in the meeting." A pause. "I am demanding, impossibly so. I've been told that my entire life, by everyone from my father to every man who's ever tried and failed to date me." "Victoria." "I'm not finished." Her voice was quiet now, none of the boardroom steel in it. "I just don't think demanding is the reason men have left. I think it's that I never let any of them close enough to find out if they could actually live with it." She didn't wait for a response. She walked back into the building, leaving Nathan standing on the sidewalk with his pulse hammering and absolutely no idea what to do with what she'd just told him. That night after Emma was asleep, Nathan sat on his fire escape with a beer he was actually drinking this time, looking out over the rooftops of Charlestown, replaying the day from every angle. The pitch, the silence in the elevator, the thing Victoria had said on the sidewalk that he was fairly sure she hadn't meant to say at all. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "This is Victoria. Marcus gave me your number for the trip logistics. Bellwether called. They want to finalize the contract details in person, in New York, by the end of next week. They've asked for both of us specifically." Nathan stared at the screen for a long moment, his heart doing something complicated. "Both of us," he typed back. "Sounds like a setup." "Don't flatter yourself, Cole. It's business." He smiled despite himself, alone on his fire escape in the dark. "Right, just business." There was a pause before her next message came through, longer than it should have taken to type 4 words. "Pack accordingly. We leave Monday." Nathan set the phone down on his knee and looked out at the city, the lights of downtown Boston blinking against a darkening sky, and felt something he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. Not since Emma's mother had walked out and taken with her any hope he'd had that two complicated, broken, busy people could actually build something real together. He felt hope. Reckless, terrifying hope. He picked the phone back up. Looking forward to it, he typed. And for the first time in 2 years of fighting with Victoria Ashcroft over fonts and budgets and impossible standards, he meant every word of something he sent her. Somewhere across the city, in a penthouse with a view she rarely looked at anymore, Victoria Ashcroft read that text 3 times before setting her phone face down on the kitchen counter, pressing her palm flat against her chest like she could physically slow down whatever was happening in there. She had spent 10 years building walls so high that nobody, not investors, not board members, not the handful of men who'd tried and failed to get close, had ever managed to climb over them. And somehow, in the space of 1 bad week, 1 accidental sentence in a meeting room, Nathan Cole had found the one door she'd forgotten to lock. Monday was 4 days away. 4 days until New York, until a hotel room down the hall from his, until 2 people who'd spent 2 years pretending their rivalry was the whole story, finally found out what had been hiding underneath it the entire time. Neither of them slept particularly well that night. Both of them, in their own separate corners of the city, kept circling back to the same 4 words. You already do. Maybe, Victoria thought, staring at her ceiling at 2 in the morning, maybe it hadn't been a slip of the tongue at all. Maybe some buried, honest part of her had simply told the truth before the rest of her could stop it. Maybe, Nathan thought, lying awake in his own bed 3 miles away, maybe 2 years of fighting hadn't been about fonts or budgets at all. Maybe it had always been the only language either of them knew how to use for something neither of them was brave enough to name. New York was coming. And whatever this was, whatever had cracked open in that conference room and refused to close back up, neither of them had any idea how to stop it now, even if some small, scared, sensible part of them still wanted to. The flight to LaGuardia took 90 minutes, and Nathan spent the first 30 of them pretending to read quarterly projections he'd already memorized, sneaking glances at Victoria in the seat across the aisle of the small company jet, who was doing an equally poor job of pretending to work through her tablet. You've read the same paragraph 4 times, she said, without looking up. You've been on the same email for 10 minutes. It's a complicated email. Sure it is. She finally looked at him, and there was something looser in her face than he was used to seeing in the office, like 30,000 feet of altitude had quietly given her permission to stop performing. Why are we being weird about this, Nathan? Being weird about what? This, the trip, sitting 4 feet apart like strangers. He set the projections down on his tray table, giving up the pretense entirely. Because 4 days ago you told me you'd never let anyone close enough to find out if they could live with you, and I haven't stopped thinking about it since. And I don't know what to do with that information while also trying to act like a professional colleague. Victoria's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in the particular way it did when she was deciding whether to retreat behind the wall or step past it. She'd been doing that a lot since the sidewalk outside Bellwether's building. Step forward, catch herself, step back. I shouldn't have said that, she said finally. Why not? It was honest. Honest things have a way of complicating business arrangements. This isn't a business arrangement, Victoria. It's a flight to New York with someone I've worked next to for 2 years and apparently still don't know at all. That landed somewhere it wasn't supposed to. He could see it in the way her shoulders dropped, just slightly, the armor cracking at the seam. What do you want to know? Everything, Nathan said before he could stop himself, and then laughed at his own intensity, dragging a hand through his hair. Sorry, that came out. Never mind. No, Victoria said. Ask me something. One thing. We have 90 minutes and nothing else to do. Nathan considered her for a long moment, the city lights of Boston long gone beneath the clouds. Nothing outside the window now but flat gray nothing. Why do you work this hard? He asked. You don't need the money. You inherited half this company before you were old enough to legally drink. You could be anywhere in the world right now doing absolutely nothing, and instead you're flying to New York on a Monday to close a deal you've already basically won. Victoria was quiet for a moment, turning her tablet face down on the tray table like she needed both hands free for this conversation, even though she didn't do anything with them except fold them in her lap. "My father built this company from nothing," she said. "He used to say that the day he stopped working harder than everyone else in the room was the day he'd start losing. I think I absorbed that a little too literally. Where is he now?" "He died when I was 26. Heart attack in his office at 11 at night, working on a deal that closed 3 days after the funeral." She said it flatly, the way people say things they've practiced saying without crying. "I took over the company 2 weeks later. I haven't really stopped since." Nathan didn't say anything right away. He just watched her, and something in his chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with strategy or business, and everything to do with recognizing a particular kind of loneliness because he'd lived next to a version of it himself. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "Don't be. It made me who I am." "It also probably made you afraid to stop," Nathan said gently. "Which isn't the same thing as making you who you are. It's making you who you think you have to be." Victoria looked at him sharply, like he'd said something nobody had said to her in a very long time, maybe ever. "That's a very specific observation for someone who just met me. I've known you 2 years. You've known Victoria Ashcroft, CEO, for 2 years. That's different. Then tell me who I'm actually flying to New York with." She was quiet again, longer this time, and Nathan let the silence sit, learning that with Victoria, the silences usually meant something was coming if you didn't rush them. "Someone who hasn't taken a real vacation in 6 years, she said eventually. "Someone whose last serious relationship ended because he told her, and I quote, that she scared him more than failure did. Someone who eats dinner alone at her desk most nights because going home to an empty penthouse feels worse than working through it." A pause. "Someone who said something true in a meeting last week and has been regretting it and not regretting it in equal measure ever since." Nathan felt that last part land somewhere behind his ribs. "I haven't stopped thinking about you saying it either." "I know," Victoria said quietly. "I can tell." The hotel in Manhattan was the kind of place where the lobby alone cost more per square foot than most people's entire apartments. All marble and soft gold lighting, and a concierge who knew Victoria's name without being told. Their rooms were on the same floor, 2 doors apart, which Nathan suspected Marcus had arranged either by accident or by design, and he genuinely could not decide which possibility made him more nervous. They had dinner reservations with the Bellwether legal team that evening, 3 hours of contract language and careful negotiation that both Nathan and Victoria handled with the same seamless rhythm they'd found in the boardroom, finishing each other's points, catching each other's mistakes before the other side noticed them, building an argument together like they'd been doing it their whole careers instead of just 2 years. "Your strategy director and your CEO function like a single negotiating unit," one of Bellwether's lawyers said afterward, half impressed, half suspicious, the way smart people get when they sense something they can't quite name. "Is that common in your organization?" "No," Victoria said. "It's just us." It was meant as a professional answer. It didn't land that way. Not to Nathan. Not in the way her eyes flicked toward him for just a half second before she turned back to the lawyer with her usual unreadable composure. By the time they made it back to the hotel, it was past 11. And the lobby was nearly empty except for a pianist playing something soft and unhurried near the bar. Victoria stopped near the elevators, not quite ready to go up, and Nathan stopped with her, because by now he was learning her rhythms well enough to know when she wasn't finished with a day yet. "Drink?" she asked. "I have a 6-year-old who video calls me at 7 a.m. sharp, regardless of time zones." "One drink, Nathan." He smiled despite himself. "One drink." They sat at the corner of the nearly empty bar, Victoria with a glass of red wine she actually drank this time, Nathan with a whiskey he nursed slowly, both of them loosening in the low light in a way the office never allowed. "Tell me about her," Victoria said. "Your daughter." Nathan's whole face changed talking about Emma. Softened, brightened, the tired strategy director disappearing and something more honest taking his place. "Her name's Emma. She's 6. She has very strong opinions about which superheroes are actually good versus just famous, and she's currently obsessed with the idea of becoming a marine biologist, which changes weekly depending on what documentary she watched last. Her mother? Nathan's jaw tightened briefly. Left when Emma was 2. Decided motherhood wasn't the life she wanted. I don't talk about her much because there isn't much to say. She's not in Emma's life, hasn't been in 4 years, and honestly most days I'm grateful because Emma deserves consistency more than she deserves complicated. That must have been hard, raising her alone. It still is, every day. He turned the whiskey glass slowly on the bar top. But it's also the best thing that's ever happened to me. I used to think my career was the thing that mattered most. Then Emma happened, and I realized I'd had it backwards the whole time. Victoria watched him with an expression Nathan hadn't seen on her before. Not the boardroom mask, not the careful diplomatic neutrality she wore in client meetings. Something open, something a little wistful. I've never wanted that, she said. Not because I don't like children, because I never believed I'd be good at it. Too much of my mother in me, maybe. She left when I was 9. Decided the company life wasn't for her either, I suppose, the same way Emma's mother decided motherhood wasn't for her. I think I learned early that people leave when things get complicated, so I made myself impossible to leave by never letting anyone close enough to try. That's not the same as being incapable of it, Victoria. That's just being scared. Careful, she said, but there was no edge in it. You're starting to sound like you know me. I'm starting to think I want to. The words sat there between them, plain and unguarded, and for once neither of them rushed to cover them with something safer. The pianist shifted into something slower. Victoria looked down at her wineglass, then back up at him. This is dangerous, she said quietly. What's happening right now? I know. We work together. I'm your boss, technically. The optics alone, I know that too. And yet you're still sitting here. So are you. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, almost something more fragile than that. I don't know how to do this, any of this. I've spent 10 years making sure I never had to. Neither do I, completely, Nathan admitted. I've spent 4 years making sure my whole life revolved around someone who's 6 years old and thinks I hung the moon. And somewhere in there, I forgot how to be anything but her dad. So we're both a little out of practice. Out of practice at what, exactly? Letting someone matter, Nathan said, and watched her go very still. I think that's what this is, Victoria. I think we've spent 2 years letting work be the only acceptable place for whatever this is to show up. Because work was safe. Work had rules. This doesn't. Victoria's hand, resting near her wineglass, moved an inch closer to his on the bar, then stopped, like she'd caught herself reaching for something she wasn't sure she was allowed to want. I should go up, she said, not moving. You should. Neither of them moved for another full minute. It was Victoria who finally stood first, smoothing down the front of her blazer, composure sliding back into place like a coat she was putting back on. We have meetings at 9. Final contract review. I'll be there. She started toward the elevator, and Nathan watched her go, the same way he'd watched her walk back into the building 4 days earlier outside Bellwether's office. That same maddening combination of wanting to follow and knowing he shouldn't. He was 3 sips into finishing his whiskey alone when he heard her voice again. Nathan. He looked up. She was standing by the elevator, doors open, holding them with one hand, looking at him across the empty lobby like she was working up the courage to say something she'd already decided against twice. Yeah? Good night, she said, which clearly wasn't what she'd been about to say, but the elevator doors closed before he could ask, and he sat there a moment longer trying to figure out what word had almost replaced it. The contract review the next morning ran long, stretching from 9 until almost 2 in the afternoon, 6 lawyers and 3 executives working through clause after clause, while Nathan and Victoria sat side by side at the conference table, occasionally exchanging the kind of look that meant we both caught that, and we both think it's a problem without either of them saying a word out loud. By the time they broke for the day, both of them were exhausted in the particular way that came from holding a professional mask over something raw and unspoken for 6 straight hours. Walk with me, Victoria said, once the lawyers had cleared out, and Marcus had confirmed the next day's signing would be the final step. I need air that doesn't smell like a conference room. They ended up in Central Park, of all places, the late afternoon sun cutting gold through the trees, joggers and tourists and nannies with strollers moving around them, while Nathan and Victoria walked slower than either of them usually allowed themselves to walk anywhere. "Can I ask you something?" Nathan said after a while. "You've been asking me things all week." "This is a different kind of thing." Victoria glanced at him sideways. "Go ahead." "What you said in the meeting, you already do." He stopped walking, and she stopped with him, a few feet apart on the path, the city noise muffled by trees and distance. "Did you mean it? Or was it just, I don't know, a reflex? Something you said to win the argument?" Victoria was quiet for long enough that Nathan thought she might not answer at all. A jogger passed between them, breaking whatever fragile thing was building, and then it was just the two of them again, standing in the middle of a park 300 miles from the office where this had all started. "I didn't plan to say it," Victoria said finally. "It just came out. The same way what you said came out. I think—" She stopped, started again, like she was choosing each word with more care than she usually allowed herself in conversation. "I think I meant it more than I wanted to. Because the truth is, Nathan, I do think about you. More than I should. More than makes sense for two people who spend most of their time arguing about font sizes and ad budgets. I notice when you're tired. I notice when something's wrong with Emma because you get quiet in meetings. I notice everything about you, and I have for longer than I'd like to admit, and I've spent 2 years pretending that noticing was just thoroughness, professional attentiveness. And now? Now I'm standing in a park telling you I don't think it was ever just that." Nathan felt something shift in his chest, something he'd been holding back for days, maybe longer, maybe since long before the conference room blow-up that had cracked everything open. "I never just tolerated you, Victoria. That's what I should have said in that meeting instead of what I actually said. I've spent 2 years looking for you in every room I walk into, every meeting, every client dinner, every late night at the office. Some part of me is always checking where you are before I even realize I'm doing it." Victoria's breath caught, visibly, the kind of reaction she clearly hadn't planned and couldn't fully control. "Say that again." "What part?" "All of it, after the meeting tomorrow. Once the contract's signed and we're not technically mid-negotiation and everything isn't tangled up with business anymore. Say it again and mean it the same way." "I will," Nathan said. "I promise." "Don't promise things you're not sure you can keep." "I'm sure," Nathan said, and the certainty in his voice surprised even him. "I've never been more sure of anything in 2 years." They didn't kiss. Neither of them reached for the other, not yet, both of them too aware of where they were and what tomorrow still required of them. A signature, a handshake, the official end of the deal that had brought them to the city in the first place. But something had shifted permanently in the space between them, something neither of them was going to be able to walk back, no matter how the next day's meeting went. That night, Nathan called Emma before bed, the way he did every night he was traveling, watching her tell him in elaborate, breathless detail about a dolphin documentary she'd watched twice in a row, about how Dana had let her stay up 10 extra minutes, about a drawing she'd made that she promised to show him the second he got home. "I miss you, Daddy," she said, her small face filling the screen, hair in 2 uneven braids Dana had clearly attempted with limited success. "I miss you too, baby girl. 2 more days, okay? Then I'm home." "Okay. Are you having fun in New York?" Nathan thought about Victoria standing in Central Park, the way she'd looked at him when she said say it again, the way 2 years of careful distance had collapsed into something neither of them seemed able or willing to stop now. "Yeah," he said, smiling despite the exhaustion of the day. "I think I am." After he hung up, he sat by the hotel window for a long time, looking out at the New York skyline, lights stacked endlessly into the dark, and he thought about how strange it was that the woman he'd spent 2 years arguing with over creative direction was somehow now the person he wanted to talk to most, the person whose opinion he found himself checking for before anyone else's, the person who'd somehow, without either of them noticing exactly when it happened, become essential. Down the hall, 2 doors away, Victoria Ashcroft sat at the small desk in her own hotel room, a contract draft open in front of her that she wasn't reading, her phone in her hand. Nathan's name pulled up in her contacts, a message typed and deleted 3 times. She thought about her father, working until the night he died because stopping felt like losing. She thought about her mother, walking away when Victoria was 9, because love, apparently, had never been enough to keep her there. She thought about 10 years of building a wall so high that nobody, not investors, not board members, not a handful of men who'd tried and given up, had ever found a way over it. And she thought about Nathan standing in Central Park saying, "I've spent 2 years looking for you in every room I walk into," and how badly she wanted, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to stop being so careful. She typed one more message, didn't delete it this time, and pressed send before she could talk herself out of it. "Tomorrow, after the signing. Don't wait for me to ask twice." 3 dots appeared almost immediately on the other end. Then his reply, "I won't." Victoria set the phone down, pressed her palm flat against her sternum the way she had 4 nights earlier in her penthouse, and for the first time in years allowed herself to feel something close to hope, instead of immediately talking herself out of it. Tomorrow the contract would be signed, the deal closed, the professional reason for this trip officially finished, and whatever was left after that, whatever neither of them had been brave enough to name yet, sitting somewhere underneath 2 years of arguments and 4 days of honesty, was finally going to have nowhere left to hide. Nathan didn't sleep well. He woke up at 5:30 to a gray New York morning, the kind of flat, overcast light that made the city look like a photograph someone had forgotten to develop all the way, and lay there on top of the covers in yesterday's shirt, staring at the ceiling, running through everything he'd said in Central Park, and trying to figure out if any of it had been a mistake. Not the feelings. He'd stopped arguing with himself about the feelings somewhere around day 2 of this trip, but the timing, the circumstances. He was her employee, technically. She signed off on his salary reviews. Their names were on a presentation that the whole industry would be watching for the next 6 months, and whatever happened between them today, whatever came after the contract signing, after the thing she'd asked him to repeat and meant it, was going to ripple outward into every professional relationship either of them had built. He told himself all of this very reasonably, staring at the ceiling, and then his phone lit up with a text from Victoria at 6:14 in the morning. "Coffee, lobby, 20 minutes. We need to go over the final numbers before the signing," and then, 30 seconds later, a second text. "Also, I couldn't sleep either." Nathan sat up, smiling at his phone in the gray light of a hotel room in a city that wasn't home, feeling 23 years old and ridiculous and more alive than he had in a very long time. 20 minutes, he typed back. "Don't order my coffee yet. You'll get it wrong. I know exactly how you take your coffee, Cole. I've been watching you ruin it for 2 years. He laughed out loud in the empty room, which was maybe the most undignified thing he'd done all week, and went to get dressed. Victoria was already at a corner table when he came down, 2 coffees in front of her, a tablet open to the contract summary, her hair down for once instead of pulled back. A small detail that somehow changed the whole geometry of her face. She looked up when he sat down, pushed the second coffee toward him without a word. He tasted it. Exactly right. "See," she said. "Okay, you know how I take my coffee. I know a lot of things about you." She said it like it was a simple fact, not a revelation, but there was color in her face that hadn't been there yesterday, the faintest kind, the kind people get when they've made a decision they're still figuring out how to live inside. "The final numbers are solid. Bellwether's legal team signed off on the last amendment at midnight. This morning is a formality. A very expensive formality. $340 million of formality," Victoria said, and for just a second the enormity of it flickered across her face. Not quite pride, something closer to relief, the kind that comes from a long time carrying something very heavy. "My father would have wanted this account. It's exactly the kind of client he spent his whole career chasing." Nathan watched her say it, the way she folded her father into the moment almost without meaning to, the habit of measuring herself against a man who'd been gone 6 years and still managed to set the bar. "He'd be proud of you," Nathan said. "Don't." Not harsh, just a reflex, the same kind of flinch he'd noticed before whenever someone tried to offer comfort she wasn't sure how to receive. "Let's get through the morning first." "All right," Nathan said, and let her redirect because he was learning when to push and when to let Victoria find her own way to the door instead of trying to open it for her. They worked through the contract summary for 40 minutes, side by side at the corner table, shoulders close enough to touch, but not quite, 2 cups of coffee going cold between them. The lobby filled slowly with morning traffic, business people and tourists and hotel staff moving around them like they were a fixed point in a fast-moving current. At one point, Nathan leaned across to point something out on the tablet, and the back of his hand brushed hers on the screen. Nothing deliberate about it, just proximity and a narrow table. Neither of them moved away. They stayed like that for a full sentence longer than necessary, both pretending to read, neither quite willing to be the one to shift back. "We should go up and get ready," Victoria said finally, her voice steady. "Yeah. The car comes at 8:30. "I know." "Nathan." "Victoria." She looked at him, close enough that he could see the slight imperfection he'd noticed before, a tiny scar near her left eyebrow, barely visible, probably from childhood, the kind of thing you only knew was there if you'd looked at someone's face long enough, often enough, carefully enough to find it. "After this morning," she said, "you promised." "I didn't forget," he said. "I haven't forgotten anything you've said to me this week." She pulled her hand back from the tablet, gathered herself the way she always did when she'd let something real show, and needed a moment to settle it back in place, and stood up. 8:30, she said, already walking toward the elevator. "I'll be in the lobby at 8:15. "Of course you will," she said, not looking back, and he knew she was smiling because he could hear it. The Bellwether signing was scheduled for 10, but Richard Bellwether arrived early, which Nathan had come to understand was simply his way. A man who got where he was going before everyone else, then waited to see how they handled the pressure of being late to something they were actually on time for. He was already at the head of the table when Nathan and Victoria walked in together, his lawyers arranged on either side of him, a pen resting precisely parallel to the contract documents like a prop in a performance. "Ms. Ashcroft," Bellwether said, rising briefly, then sitting again. "Mr. Cole." "Mr. Bellwether." Victoria crossed the room without hesitating, hand extended, the full force of her professional gravity aimed at the older man like a precision instrument. "Thank you for making time this morning." "Time is the one thing I can't make more of," Bellwether said, which seemed like a thing he said often. His eyes moved between them, sharp and assessing. "I'll confess something to you both. We came close to going with Meridian last month." The room got slightly cooler. Nathan felt it even across the table. "I know," Victoria said, which clearly surprised Bellwether. "They pitched you in February. I read the trade coverage. Their offer was 15% below ours, and their creative director hasn't won an industry award since 2019. Bellwether's mouth moved in a way that might have been a smile in different company. "Then you also know why we ultimately didn't." "Because Meridian would have given you a competent campaign," Nathan said, stepping in on instinct, the same rhythm as the first presentation. "We're offering you something that lasts. You don't just want visibility. You want the kind of brand perception that makes a 100-year-old company feel like the next thing instead of the last thing. That's a different ask, and it requires a team that's built for it." Bellwether looked at him for a long, measuring moment. "You two have an unusual dynamic," he said. "We've been told," Victoria said neutrally. "It works in your favor. My executive team hasn't stopped talking about the first presentation. Some of them thought it was rehearsed, the way you finished each other's points." "Was it?" "No," Nathan said. "No," Victoria said at exactly the same second. Bellwether picked up the pen. "Good. Rehearsed things fall apart. Built things last." He signed the first page with the particular slowness of a man who understood the weight of the moment and wasn't in a hurry to move past it. "Welcome to Bellwether Ashcroft Media." Across the table, Nathan and Victoria looked at each other, and the thing that passed between them in that half-second, the shared weight of 2 years of work, of one very long week, of everything still waiting on the other side of the morning, was not something anyone else in the room could have read, but it didn't need to be. The lawyers filed out in clusters. Bellwether's assistant appeared with a bottle of champagne that nobody had asked for, which was poured into glasses nobody was particularly ready for at 10:15 in the morning. There was handshaking and photo-taking and the particular kind of corporate celebration that felt like holding a cup of hot coffee with both hands. Satisfying, but requiring concentration. And then, gradually, the room emptied, and it was just the two of them standing among the cleared glasses and the push-back chairs and the signed contracts sitting on the table between them like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Nathan looked at her across the table. After the meeting, he said. Victoria looked back at him. We're after the meeting. Yeah. He came around the table slowly, no rush, both of them breathing through something that had been building since Tuesday in Boston and now had nothing left to hide behind. I never simply tolerated you, he said. That's what I should have said. Not what I said. Not the thing about impossible standards, even if it was true, and I'd say it again. I should have said I've spent 2 years looking for you in every room before I find my own seat. That every argument we've ever had has been the only acceptable way I could figure out to stay close to you without admitting why. That I've noticed every single thing about you. How you hold your coffee cup when you're nervous. How you go very still when something surprises you. How you carry your father with you into every room and you don't even know you're doing it. He stopped a foot away from her, close enough to see the small scar near her eyebrow, the one he'd looked at too many times to count. You asked me to say it again. That's me saying it again. Victoria hadn't moved. Her hands were at her sides, and she was holding herself very still the way she did when she was trying not to react before she'd decided how she felt about something. The composure that had survived boardrooms and press conferences, and the particular cruelty of investors who underestimated her. All of it gathered around her like armor, while something underneath it tried very hard to come through. I'm afraid of this, she said. Her voice was quiet, steadier than it had any right to be given what her eyes were doing. I want to be honest about that. I don't say things like I'm afraid to people. I don't say things like that to anyone. But you asked me to be honest this week, and I have been. And I'm going to finish being honest now, even though it's terrifying me a little. Tell me. I've built everything I have by refusing to need anyone, Victoria said. My company, my reputation, my entire life. I built it specifically so that nobody could ever take anything from me by leaving. Because they always leave, Nathan. My mother left. Every man I've tried to be with has left. My father, her voice caught, just briefly, a crack in the foundation she normally kept sealed. My father didn't leave by choice, but he's still gone. And I made a decision a long time ago that I would rather be alone than spend my life waiting for the part where someone else decides I'm too much or too cold or too lonely to be worth staying for. Victoria, I'm not done. She pressed on, the way she always did, because stopping mid-argument had never been in her nature. The thing I'm most afraid of isn't the office gossip or the board scrutiny or the professional complications. It's that I'll let you in, and you'll figure out that all of this, she gestured at herself, a bare, almost helpless gesture, completely unlike her, all the things underneath the CEO, underneath the billionaire, underneath the impossible standards, isn't enough, that I won't be enough. And then I'll have given something up I can't rebuild. The room was entirely quiet. Nathan took the last step closer, slowly enough that she could have stepped back if she'd wanted to. She didn't step back. You want to know what I see when I look at you? He said. Not the CEO, not the company owner who's made 3 executives cry in board meetings. A beat. Actually, I've found that kind of impressive, if I'm honest. Something broke loose in Victoria's face. Not quite a laugh, but something close. Something that pushed back against the tears she was very clearly not going to allow herself to cry in a bellwether conference room. What I see, Nathan continued, is someone who works 18-hour days because she's still trying to be worthy of a father who already believed she was worth everything. Who built walls so high that the only person who managed to get under her skin did it by arguing with her about slide decks. Who ordered my coffee correctly this morning without having to ask, which means you've been paying attention to me for 2 years while we both pretended we were just fighting. He reached up, carefully, and pushed a strand of hair back from her face, the same gesture the wind had made in Central Park 2 days earlier, except this time it was him. You are not a convenience, Victoria. You're not a passing thing. You are the most complicated, infuriating, brilliant person I've been in the same room with, and I have chosen to be in that room every single day for 2 years. I'd choose it for a lot more than that. Victoria looked at him for a long moment, something working through her expression that he couldn't quite read, the way certain weather systems you could see coming from a distance but couldn't predict which way they'd turn. You have a 6-year-old daughter, she said finally. I do. I don't know anything about being good at that. I told you, I don't have a model for it. Neither did I when Emma was born. I figured it out. You'd figure it out too. You're very confident in things you have no guarantee of. I'm confident in you, he said. That's enough for right now. She was quiet for another long moment, and then she reached up and put her hand over the one he still had resting near her face, covering it with her palm, warm and deliberate, the first time in this entire week she'd reached for him first. I'm probably going to be terrible at this, she said, her voice lower now, the last of the armor coming down so slowly he could almost hear it. I'm going to forget things and work too late and be difficult in ways that have nothing to do with font sizes. And I'm going to need you to tell me when I'm doing it because I genuinely won't always know. I'm going to say the wrong thing in meetings, Nathan said. I already have a track record, and I have an opinionated 6-year-old who will want to give you her full assessment of every superhero, and that assessment will be lengthy and non-negotiable. A real smile came through then, not the controlled professional one she aimed at clients, but the rare, unguarded kind he'd caught glimpses of all week, the one that changed her face entirely. I can handle that, she said quietly. Yeah? I handle impossible things for a living. He kissed her then, soft and unhurried, nothing like the charged electricity of the week building toward it, which was the thing about this that surprised him most. How quiet it felt. How sure. Not a collision, not the release of 2 years of tension exploding into something dramatic, but more like the last piece of a very long sentence finally finding its period. Victoria's hand tightened over his, and she kissed him back, and for 30 seconds in an empty conference room in Manhattan, neither of them was a CEO or a strategy director or a single father or a woman who'd built an empire on not needing anyone. They were just two people who'd been circling the same truth for too long and had finally stopped running from it. When they pulled back, Victoria's forehead tipped toward his briefly, her eyes still closed. Nathan stayed still, letting her have the moment, learning already that she processed things at her own pace and rushing her never helped. We have a 4:00 flight, she said finally. I know. Marcus is going to combust when he finds out. Marcus figured it out 3 days ago, I promise you. She pulled back enough to look at him, the ghost of that rare smile still sitting on her face. That obvious? We're the only 2 people in the office who thought it wasn't. She let out a slow breath, and he could see the calculation running in the back of her mind, not about feelings, that part seemed settled, but about what happened next. The practical architecture of it. The structure she'd need to build to protect what they'd built professionally while not pretending this was something it wasn't. Victoria's brain never fully turned off, and he was starting to understand that wasn't a flaw. It was just who she was. I'm going to need to restructure some reporting lines, she said, and the fact that she was already thinking about it, about protecting him, about making it fair, made something tighten warmly in his chest. We can talk about it on the plane. We're not talking business on the plane. Okay, we don't have to. We're going to talk about what happens when we land, she said, smoothing her blazer with both hands, the gesture of someone collecting themselves after something significant, which this had been. What we tell people, how we handle it. Together, Nathan said simply. She looked at him. Together, she agreed like she was trying out the word, seeing how it fit, whether it would hold her weight. It seemed like it did, because she didn't reach for anything else to replace it. The car to the airport moved through midday Manhattan traffic at the particular pace of a city that had somewhere to be and was going to take its time about it. Nathan and Victoria sat in the back with a professional distance between them that had nothing to do with how they actually felt and everything to do with the driver and the glass partition that wasn't quite as opaque as it looked. Tell me something else, Nathan said, because he'd learned by now that this was the easiest way in, and he wasn't ready to stop learning her. Victoria looked sideways at him. What do you want to know? Something nobody at the office knows about you. Something real. She thought about it, watching the city move past the window, the particular blur of yellow cabs and construction scaffolding and corner bodegas that made New York look like itself and nowhere else. I wanted to be an architect, she said eventually, before the company. I had 3 colleges lined up, full acceptances. I was going to build things, not buy them, design them. What happened? My father got sick. Before he died, before the heart attack, there was a period when we thought it might be something longer and slower, and I came back to help him run the company, and then it turned out to be shorter and faster than anyone expected, And then the company was mine, and the architecture schools were still there, but it felt like a door I'd walked past too many times to go back through. Do you regret it? Some days, she said without hesitation, which meant it was honest. On the days when I'm in a board meeting that's been going 3 hours and we're arguing about margin percentages, I regret it significantly. Nathan smiled. You could still build things. I build companies. It's not the same. No, she said. It's not. A beat. But it's not nothing either. I think I used to believe it was nothing, that I'd traded the real thing for the convenient one, but I don't know. This week made me think differently about it. This week made me think differently about a lot of things. She reached across the seat between them, not dramatically, just her hand settling against his on the leather, easy and quiet, the way you do something when it started to feel familiar already. Nathan turned his palm up and let her settle there, neither of them making it into more than it was, which was just two people at the beginning of something being careful with it. By the time they reached LaGuardia, they'd talked through 4 years of Nathan raising Emma alone. The particular exhaustion and the particular joy of it, the way his priorities had reshuffled completely around a person who was half his height and convinced that starfish were the most underappreciated animal in the ocean. Victoria listened with a focus Nathan hadn't ever seen her direct at anything that wasn't a quarterly report, asking questions that were specific and thoughtful, nothing performative about them. She sounds like someone with very clear ideas about how the world works, Victoria said as they walked through the terminal. Absolute conviction about everything, Nathan said. She gets it from me, which is, unfortunately, for everyone. She might get it from somewhere else, too, Victoria said carefully, which was the first time she'd acknowledged, even obliquely, that she saw herself in the picture beyond this week, beyond the abstract version they'd talked about in the conference room. Nathan looked at her. Yeah, he said. Maybe. They boarded the flight in the same seats as before, across the aisle from each other, and somewhere over Connecticut, Nathan looked across and found Victoria already looking at him, her tablet face down on the tray table, no pretense of working. What? He said. Nothing, she said. I'm just... She stopped. Tried again. I'm not used to this. Feeling like the thing I'm going towards is better than the thing I'm running from. Usually, I'm just running. You don't have to run from anything right now. I know. She said it like it still surprised her. That's what I'm sitting here figuring out how to live inside. Boston appeared below them through the window, the harbor catching the late afternoon light, the familiar skyline coming in from the east, and Nathan watched it materialize and felt the week settle over him like something he was going to carry differently than anything else he'd carried in a long time. They landed at 5:40. Nathan had a daughter to get home to, and Dana had a 9 o'clock commitment, and the ordinary machinery of his life was waiting for him at baggage claim, the same as it always was. Late notices and daycare schedules, and the particular small economy of a single father who loved his job but knew what came first. Victoria's car was waiting on the departure level. His car service was a different company, less expensive, slightly later arriving. They stood in the terminal for a moment on the way out, the flow of returning travelers moving around them. Thank you, Victoria said. Not the polite professional version, the actual one. For what? For not letting me pretend this week was just business. You weren't pretending that hard, Nathan said. I know. That's what scared me. He reached out and tucked the strand of hair back from her face again. The same gesture as the conference room, already becoming a thing between them without having been designated one. I'll call you when I'm home. Emma first, Victoria said immediately, which caught him entirely off guard, the specificity of it, the fact that she'd already filed it correctly in her head. Emma first, he agreed, and something in his chest settled into place. He watched her car pull out into the early evening traffic, the city closing back around it, and stood there an extra moment with his bag over his shoulder and the week's weight on him in a way that wasn't heavy, exactly, just present, significant, the kind of thing you carry carefully because you know it matters. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He expected Dana. He expected Emma's daycare with a note about the week's schedule. It was Victoria. I told you I know how you take your coffee. I know a lot of other things too. We'll figure out the rest. Nathan stood outside Logan Airport, reading that text in the last of the afternoon light, the city noise around him, and an entire future sitting on the other side of this week, imperfect and uncertain and genuinely, terrifyingly real. He typed back, "We will," and meant it completely. The thing about Boston was that it never gave you long to settle back in before it reminded you that life had kept moving while you were away. Nathan got home on a Thursday evening, paid Dana, ate the leftover pasta she'd made because she knew he wouldn't have eaten on the plane, and sat on the edge of Emma's bed for 20 minutes, listening to her give him the full dolphin documentary recap in real time, complete with her own editorial commentary on which dolphins were clearly the smart ones and which had made questionable choices. He laughed in the right places and asked questions he already knew the answers to and felt, for the first time in a long time, like his life had a shape to it that made sense from more than one angle. Emma fell asleep mid-sentence around 9 o'clock, the way she always did. 1 minute fully animated and the next completely out, like a light switched off. Nathan sat in the chair by her window a little longer than necessary, watching the rise and fall of her breathing, thinking about Victoria standing in a conference room in Manhattan, saying she sounds like someone with very clear ideas about how the world works. He called Victoria at 9:30, after he'd confirmed Emma was actually down and not just resting between stories. She picked up on the second ring. "You made it home." "Emma first, like promised. She's out. Dolphins wore her down." "How extensive was the briefing?" 45 minutes. I got a full character breakdown of each dolphin. There were favorites, and there were, quote, bad decision makers. Victoria laughed. A real one, not the polished professional version. The one he'd started hearing for the first time this week. The one that came from somewhere lower in her chest and had no performance in it at all. "I want to hear about the bad decision makers someday." "She'd be delighted to tell you personally," Nathan said, and then the easy naturalness of it caught them both slightly off guard, the way the future had slipped into the sentence without either of them planning it. A beat of quiet. "Nathan," Victoria said. "Yeah. Tomorrow's going to be complicated." "I know. I've been thinking about it on the drive home. The office doesn't know anything yet, but they will the moment we walk in together, and the dynamic is different, and people on that floor are observant. They've already been watching us since Tuesday." "They've been watching us since the day I was hired," Nathan said. 2 years ago. "I think 3 different people have had a betting pool going since the second month." "That's," Victoria paused, "that's not as surprising as it should be." Another pause. "I want to handle this correctly. Not because I'm ashamed of it, I want to be clear about that. But because if we walk in tomorrow and it looks like we hid something, or like it happened in a way that compromised the Bellwether account, it becomes a story that's bigger than us. It affects the whole team. So we tell them directly," Nathan said, "before the rumor mill does it for us." "I've been thinking about restructuring as well. I talked to our corporate attorney on the drive from the airport. She says the cleanest path is to restructure the reporting lines so that you report directly to the board rather than to me operationally. You'd keep all your responsibilities, same title, same team. I just wouldn't be your direct supervisor on paper. It protects us both." "You already called your attorney?" "I called her from the car," Victoria said, which was so entirely Victoria that Nathan felt something warm move through him just hearing it. "I told you I'd think about the structure. This is me thinking about the structure. At 6:30 in the evening on a Thursday. I don't stop thinking at 6:30 on Thursdays." "No," Nathan said. "You don't." He leaned his head back against the chair. "Okay. We go in tomorrow, we tell the team, you announce the restructure at the same time, so it's clear this was handled properly. No secrets, no sneaking around. I've never been good at sneaking around. You've never been good at anything that required pretending you weren't exactly who you are. Is that a compliment?" "It's absolutely a compliment," Nathan said. "Get some sleep, Victoria. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." "It's going to be fine," she said, in the particular tone she used when she was saying a thing she needed to believe more than she was reporting a fact. "It's going to be fine," he agreed, and meant it somewhat more than she did. The 31st floor of Ashcroft Media had a particular frequency on Friday mornings, a buzz of end-of-week energy mixed with the communal relief that the week was almost over, which Nathan had always found useful for delivering news that might otherwise land harder. People were looser on Fridays, less armored. He got in at 8:40, his usual time, and was at his desk with his coffee and his inbox open when Priya materialized beside him at 9:03 with the expression of someone who was vibrating on the inside but maintaining plausible deniability on the outside. "How was New York?" she asked, setting a project file on his desk that she clearly had no actual reason to put on his desk. "Productive," Nathan said. "Bellwether signed?" "Yesterday morning." Priya's eyes moved to Victoria's office, visible through the glass wall where Victoria was already at her desk, on the phone, not looking out at the floor. Then back to Nathan. "And everything else was fine?" "Everything else was fine, Priya." "Okay," she said, in the specific tone of someone who did not believe the word fine was doing the work it was being asked to do. She retrieved her project file, which had never needed to be on his desk in the first place, and walked back to her station with the careful nonchalance of a person who was going to text the office group chat the moment she was out of his eye line. Nathan let her go. It didn't matter. In about 2 hours, the conversation she was currently speculating about was going to happen in front of the entire team, and whatever she and the group chat had cobbled together in the meantime was going to be moot. He caught Victoria's eye through the glass wall around 9:30. She was off the phone, standing at her desk, and she looked at him with a steadiness that said, "I'm ready when you are," without a single word crossing the distance between them. He gave her a small nod. She picked up her phone and texted Marcus. At 10 o'clock, Marcus appeared in the middle of the floor looking slightly pale, the way he always looked when he'd been given a task without an explanation and was being asked to trust the process. "Full team meeting in conference room A," he announced, in a voice carefully calibrated to sound routine. "Everyone, 10 minutes. The floor shifted into the particular murmur of people who knew a full team meeting on a Friday with one day's notice was not, in fact, routine. Nathan watched the faces. Priya exchanging a look with someone in the design corner, the two junior strategists near the window stopping mid-conversation, the account managers gathering their coffee cups with the air of people preparing for something they hadn't been briefed on. He gathered his own coffee and walked to conference room A with the unhurried pace of a man who had made his decision and was not interested in second-guessing it. Victoria was already at the front of the room when the last team member came through the door. 34 people, the full strategy and creative floor. She waited until the door closed before she spoke. "I'll keep this short," she said, which earned a laugh from nobody because nobody was laughing yet. 2 things. First, Bellwether Incorporated signed with us yesterday morning in New York. $340 million over 4 years starting in Q1. That's because of the work every single person in this room did over the last 3 months, and I want to be clear that it doesn't go unrecognized. Bonuses will reflect it. The room came to life at that. Real, genuine relief and excitement moving through 34 people who'd put in long nights on that pitch. Someone in the back said yes under their breath. Priya pressed both hands flat on the conference table like she needed to stabilize herself. Victoria let it settle for a moment, then continued, and Nathan watched the room recalibrate as her tone shifted, not harder, just more deliberate. Second thing, I'm announcing a structural change effective Monday. Nathan Cole's reporting line will shift from direct CEO oversight to board-level operations, effective immediately. His title, responsibilities, and team remain unchanged. The change is administrative, not evaluative. A very specific quality of quiet settled over the room, the kind that came from people who were doing math very fast. "And," Victoria said, with the same controlled steadiness she brought to everything that cost her something, "Nathan and I are in a relationship. That's the reason for the restructure. I want to be transparent with the team rather than have this become something that gets discussed in hallways and speculated about in ways that are unfair to either of us or to you." Absolute silence for 3 full seconds. Nathan kept his eyes on the room, not on Victoria, watching 34 people process information at 34 different speeds. Then Priya said very quietly, "I knew it." And the room broke. Not badly. Not chaos, not scandal, Just the particular eruption of a group of people who had apparently been waiting for this news for longer than Nathan had been ready to give it to them. There was laughter, genuine and warm, a little startled. Someone in the back started applauding slowly until two other people joined in, and then stopped, uncertain. One of the junior strategists looked openly delighted. Marcus, standing by the door, had an expression that might have been relief. Nathan stood up from where he'd been sitting along the wall, moved to the front of the room, and stood beside Victoria. Close, but not performing it. Just present. It felt like the right thing, to be visible, to not let her carry it alone. "I know how offices work," he said. "I know there have been theories on this floor for a long time, and I know that some of you have money on it in some group chat I'm not in. So let me say directly, nothing that happened in New York this week affected the Bellwether deal. We won that account because this team built something worth winning with. The restructure exists to make sure the professional integrity of this company stays exactly what it's always been." He paused. "And also because Victoria is impossible to work under, which I say with complete affection." Victoria turned her head to look at him, the barest flicker of that rare smile. "You're going to pay for that later," she said, quiet enough that only he caught it. The tension in the room, what was left of it, dissolved. But they paid for it by afternoon. Not in the way Victoria had said, not in any way Nathan had dreaded. But the day did not unfold cleanly. By noon, three things had happened that reminded both of them that transparency was necessary and the right choice, and also uncomfortable in the specific way that all right choices tended to be. The first was Gerald Morrow, a senior account manager who'd been at the company 8 years, since before Victoria had taken it over from her father, and who appeared in Nathan's office doorway at 11:30 with an expression that sat somewhere between concern and barely concealed resentment. "I need to ask you something directly," Gerald said, closing the door behind him, which Nathan noticed. "Go ahead." "The Harmon account, Q3 review. I didn't get the senior lead position. You told me it went to the board's preference. Was it actually your call?" Nathan looked at him steadily. "It was the board's decision. I recommended you. The board went a different direction. That's what I told you in October, and that's exactly what happened." "Before," Gerald said with pointed emphasis. "Before whatever is now going on between you and Victoria." "Gerald," Nathan kept his voice even. "My relationship with Victoria Ashcroft didn't exist in October. It didn't exist 2 weeks ago. Nothing that happened before this week was affected by something that didn't exist before this week." Gerald held his gaze for a long moment, the assessment in it uncomfortable but fair. Nathan didn't look away because he had nothing to hide, and looking away would have made it look otherwise. "All right," Gerald said finally, and left. Nathan sat with that for a few minutes after the door closed. It wasn't personal, Gerald's suspicion. It was the rational question that came from working in any environment where the lines between professional and personal could blur. The question was fair. The discomfort of it was fair. What mattered was that the answer was clean, and it was. The second thing was a call that came to Victoria's office at 2 in the afternoon from the company's outside PR firm, forwarded from a business journalist at a Boston Financial Quarterly who had apparently already gotten wind of the Bellwether signing and was calling to confirm whether the rumors about a relationship between the CEO and a senior executive were accurate and whether the board had signed off on it. Victoria put the call on hold, walked to Nathan's office, which she did not typically do. She usually sent Marcus, and stood in his doorway with her phone in her hand and a look on her face that was not panic exactly, but its first cousin. "Press," she said. "Already?" Business journalism in this city runs on who told who, and apparently someone told someone. She came in and closed the door, which was itself a new development. Victoria in his office with the door closed. "The board needs to hear this from me before they read it somewhere. I should have called them this morning. That was a mistake. So call them now." "Thomas Aldridge is going to lose his mind," she said, referring to the board's most conservative member, a 72-year-old former investment banker who wore his skepticism of Victoria's leadership style openly in every quarterly meeting. "Thomas Aldridge has been looking for a reason to lose his mind for 3 years, Nathan said. "You've given him nothing. This is not nothing, but it's also not what he's going to try to make it. He's going to call it a conflict of interest. You've already restructured the reporting line. You announced it to the entire company this morning. You went out of your way to be transparent before anyone had the chance to ask questions. Thomas Aldridge can call it whatever he wants, but the structural record says otherwise. Victoria looked at him, the calculation running at full speed behind her eyes, weighing angles the way she always did when she was in a situation she hadn't been able to control perfectly from the start. "You're not scared of this," she said, like she was observing a phenomenon. "I've been scared of this all week," Nathan said honestly. "I'm less scared of it now than I was Tuesday. And by next Tuesday, I'll be even less scared. Because it's real, Victoria. Actual real things tend to hold up better than the things people just assume are problems." She took a breath, nodded once to herself. The particular nod that meant she'd made a decision and was done second-guessing it, and walked back out to call the board. The third thing was harder than the journalist, and harder than Gerald Morrow, and harder, honestly, than any of the professional complications, because it came from somewhere Nathan hadn't been thinking to guard against. His sister Dana called him at 3:15. "I saw it," Dana said without preamble. "Someone from your office texted someone I know, who texted someone else, and now apparently the whole city of Boston knows you're dating your boss." "She's not technically my boss anymore, as of this morning. She's still the owner of the company, Nathan." "I know that. Does Emma know?" Nathan closed his eyes briefly. "Not yet. It's been 14 hours, Dana." "I'm not criticizing," Dana said, which was her way of saying she was about to criticize. I need to ask. Is this serious? Because Emma is 6. She gets attached fast. Remember when her kindergarten teacher moved to Portland and she cried for 2 weeks? If you bring someone into her life who then— "I know," Nathan said. "I know all of that. Do you think I'm not thinking about all of that?" Silence on the other end. Then Dana, quieter. "I've watched you be careful for 4 years. So careful it's been a little heartbreaking sometimes. I just want to make sure careful is still happening." "It is," Nathan said. "It's just careful and not moving at all are different things, Dana. I've been not moving for 4 years. That's not the same as being careful. It just looks the same from the outside." His sister was quiet for a moment. "Tell me about her." So he did. He sat in his office on a Friday afternoon in Boston, the floor quieting down around him as people started filtering out for the weekend, and he told his sister about Victoria Ashcroft, not the CEO, not the billionaire, but the woman who'd wanted to be an architect, who called her lawyer from the car, who'd watched him with such attention for 2 years that she knew exactly how he took his coffee, who'd said, "I'm afraid of this" in an empty conference room, and said it anyway because she'd promised to be honest. When he finished, Dana was quiet long enough that he checked to see if the call had dropped. "She sounds like a lot," Dana said finally. "She is." "Okay," Dana said. "Okay, just careful. Always." After he hung up, Nathan sat for a moment with the phone in his hand, thinking about Emma, about how and when and in what sequence a 6-year-old got introduced to the concept that her dad had a life that was slightly larger than the two of them, and the rotating cast of cartoon marine biologists on the documentary streaming service. There was no perfect answer to that. There was just timing and care, and trusting that Emma, who had strong opinions about dolphins and superhero credibility and the correct placement of unicorn stickers, was more adaptable than he sometimes gave her credit for. Victoria texted him at 4 o'clock. "Board call done." Thomas Aldridge said, and I'm quoting directly, "This is precisely the kind of decision I've been waiting for you to make poorly." I told him the restructure was already in place and the account was already signed, and if he had a legal concern, he was welcome to bring it to the full board, and he did not bring it to the full board. Marcus is making it the subject of needlepoint art. Nathan laughed out loud at his desk for the second time in a week, alone in his office, which was becoming a theme. "That's a win," he typed back. "It's a small win. There will be larger ones required." "I know. One Friday at a time." A pause. Then, "Are you going to be okay this weekend? With Emma? Is she going to have questions you don't know how to answer yet?" Nathan looked at the text for a long moment, struck, not for the first time this week, but freshly, by how Victoria showed up in the specific details. Not a general "let me know if you need anything." The actual particular question about Emma, about the specific thing that would actually require navigating. Probably, he typed. She'll be fine. She's tougher than both of us. She has to be, with your taste in font sizes influencing her upbringing. I will not be taking criticism on this from someone who once sent back a presentation because the shade of blue was 2 degrees too corporate. That shade of blue was 2 degrees too corporate. He was grinning at his phone like an idiot in his own office, and he did not particularly care. The following 2 weeks moved with the specific friction of a machine that was being run correctly but was still breaking in. Not badly, not catastrophically. Just the ordinary roughness of 2 people and 1 organization adjusting to a new truth. Gerald Morrow came back to Nathan's office on the Tuesday after the announcement, quieter than before, and said he'd looked back at the October communications and confirmed that the board record matched what Nathan had told him. He didn't apologize exactly, but he offered to grab coffee, which was close enough. Nathan accepted. Thomas Aldridge requested a full written account of the restructure timeline, which Victoria provided within 48 hours, 5 pages, annotated, with the legal review attached. Aldridge read it, found no purchase for his objections, and filed it without comment. Victoria told Nathan about it over the phone that night with the controlled satisfaction of someone who had known they were right and had simply waited for the record to confirm it. The press piece ran in the Boston Financial Quarterly on the following Thursday, half a column buried inside the business section, mostly about the Bellwether deal, with a single paragraph noting that a relationship between the CEO and the agency's strategy director had been disclosed and structural changes implemented. Nothing explosive, nothing that stayed in the news cycle past Friday. "That's it?" Nathan said when Victoria forwarded it to him. "That's it," she said. "Scandals need someone doing something wrong. We didn't give them that. We gave them the boring version. The boring version is the only version I was ever willing to give them." On the floor, the adjustment was quicker than Nathan had expected, partly because the team had apparently been waiting for this longer than he'd known, and partly because nothing in the day-to-day operations actually changed in any way that affected anyone's work. Nathan still ran the strategy meetings, still pushed back on creative decisions, still argued over presentations with the same focused intensity he always had. He just didn't argue with Victoria in them anymore. They'd developed a different shorthand, quieter, the kind built out of knowing each other well enough that the argument happened before the meeting and the meeting just reflected the conclusion. It was Priya who said it out loud, 3 weeks in, without particularly meaning to. She was in Nathan's office going over the Bellwether campaign rollout calendar, and she stopped mid-sentence and looked at him with the expression of someone who has just organized a thought they'd been carrying around unorganized. "You're less tense," she said. "Am I? For 2 years you've had this thing, like you were always compensating for something, pushing twice as hard as you needed to on every argument, like you needed to prove the argument was about the work." She paused. "I think maybe it wasn't always about the work." Nathan gave her a look. "I'm not trying to be weird about it," Priya said, going back to the calendar. "I'm just saying it's easier to be in rooms with you now. That's all." He thought about that later, driving home, stopped at a red light on the bridge over the Charles River, the city smearing its lights across the water below him. 2 years of arguing about things that were partly what they looked like and partly something else entirely, the argument standing in for whatever he hadn't been ready to say directly. He thought about Emma in her bed, about Dana's voice on the phone asking him to be careful, about Victoria in an office 2 miles away, probably still at her desk at 7:30, working through something that had another hour left in it. He texted her at the light, one-handed, which he technically shouldn't have done. "Still at your desk?" The answer came while he was pulling into his street, finishing the Aldridge notes. "Why?" "Just checking." "You check on me a lot." "You check on me too." "You asked about Emma 3 times this week." A pause. "She mentioned something in the background when you called Wednesday. Something about whether dolphins can smell." I looked it up. Nathan sat in his parked car outside his apartment building reading that text and felt something move through him that he couldn't have named quickly. Not love. That word was still too new and too large to say out loud yet. Not to himself. Not to her. But something adjacent to it. Something that felt like recognition. Like looking at someone and seeing a version of a life you hadn't known you were hoping for. Can they? He typed back. Poorly, Victoria wrote. Their olfactory systems are significantly limited compared to terrestrial mammals, though some species appear to detect chemical signals in the water, useful for tracking food. Emma would probably find this interesting. Nathan sat in his car laughing until he had to wipe his eyes. He went upstairs, relieved Dana, sat on the bathroom floor while Emma brushed her teeth and told him about the injustice of having a bedtime that was 15 minutes earlier than her best friend's, and tucked her in with the particular inefficiency of a dad who was never quite ready to end the evening. Because these evenings, all of them, even the ordinary ones, especially the ordinary ones, were the thing his entire life orbited around. And then he sat on the couch in the quiet of his small Charlestown apartment and called Victoria, and they talked for an hour about nothing that mattered and everything that did. The bellwether rollout calendar, the architecture book she'd bought and hadn't told anyone about, the documentary Emma had recommended to him with such authority that he'd found himself actually curious. The specific way Thomas Aldridge had said once again in a tone that implied history when there wasn't any, and whether the shade of blue in the Bellwether campaign launch materials was, in fact, 2 degrees too corporate. It's fine, Nathan said. It's marginally too corporate. Victoria, I'm right about this. You're almost always right, and it's exhausting, and I mean that as the highest possible compliment. A pause. He could hear a shift on the other end. A chair, maybe her couch, the sound of someone settling into an evening instead of working through it. Nathan, she said. Yeah. A pause, the particular kind where she was deciding how honest to be. I'm glad we didn't let it stay what it was. The rivalry. The thing we were both calling the rivalry because we didn't know what else to call it. Nathan leaned his head back against the couch cushion, looking at the ceiling of the apartment where Emma's unicorn stickers had somehow migrated from the bedroom door to the living room trim during a week when his supervision had apparently lapsed. Me too, he said. I've been glad about it since Tuesday in Boston, if I'm completely honest. What happened Tuesday in Boston? She asked, and then answered herself immediately. The meeting, what you said. What you said back. You already do, Victoria said, and the way she said it now was entirely different from the way she'd said it in the conference room 3 weeks ago. Quieter, claimed. Yeah, Nathan said. They stayed on the line a moment longer without saying anything, the comfortable quiet of 2 people who'd figured out by now that they didn't have to fill all the space, that some of it could just be there between them, easy and undemanding, which for both of them was newer than it looked. Go to sleep, Victoria. I will in a minute. That means an hour. Good night, Nathan. Good night. He sat in the quiet after the call, the apartment settling around him, Emma breathing down the hall, the city doing its nighttime thing outside the window, and he thought about the words he hadn't said yet. The 4-letter one, the one that was sitting inside his chest already, with its bags unpacked, making itself comfortable, showing no signs of leaving. He wasn't ready to say it out loud. Not yet. That was still ahead of him, waiting at some point down the road. At some ordinary moment he probably wouldn't see coming until it was right in front of him. But he knew it was there. And for the first time in a long time, knowing something was coming didn't make him want to step sideways out of its path. He turned off the living room light and went to bed, and for the 3rd night running, he slept without lying awake working through the angles. Which was, for a man who had spent 4 years lying awake working through the angles, its own kind of extraordinary. The Bellwether campaign launched on a Tuesday in March, which was not a day anyone would have chosen for a landmark moment, but which turned out to be exactly right anyway, the way ordinary days sometimes become the ones you remember. Nathan was in the office at 7, which was early even for him, walking through the final rollout checklist with the campaign team, while the city outside was still doing its slow morning wake-up, the harbor gray and flat, the kind of March cold that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to give way to spring or dig in for another 2 weeks. The campaign was going live across 17 markets simultaneously, digital, print, broadcast, the full scope of what $340 million over 4 years actually looked like in practice. The Bellwether brand, 100 years old and feeling every one of them before they'd gotten to it, was about to step back into public consciousness, looking like something people under 40 might actually care about. The first numbers came in at 9:15. Priya pulled them up on the main screen in the strategy room, and for a moment nobody said anything, just looked at the engagement metrics scrolling in from the East Coast markets, the click-through rates, the social response moving faster than the projections had modeled. "That's," one of the junior strategists started. "That's better than the model," Nathan said, which was the most restrained possible way to say what everyone in the room was looking at. By 10 o'clock, the Boston Financial Trade Press had already picked it up. By noon, 2 national industry publications had run pieces. By 3 in the afternoon, Richard Bellwether himself called Victoria's direct line, which he had never done without going through Marcus first, and stayed on for 22 minutes, which Marcus timed because Marcus timed everything. Nathan was in his own office when Victoria appeared in his doorway afterward, and he knew from the way she was holding herself, shoulders down, something loose in her face that was not her usual controlled composure, that the call had gone the way the numbers suggested it should have gone. "He used the word landmark," she said. "Bellwether said landmark?" "Richard Bellwether, who once told me in a contract meeting that the word revolutionary should be retired from the marketing industry's vocabulary because nothing had been revolutionary since the printing press, called our campaign landmark." She leaned against the door frame, and something about the posture, the particular exhaustion of a person who had worked very hard toward something for a very long time and had just seen it arrive, made Nathan set down what he was doing and just look at her. "We did it," she said quietly, to herself as much as to him. "We did it," he said. She came into the office and sat down in the chair across from his desk, which she also never did. She stood in doorways, she held meetings. She didn't sit in people's offices and just be. And for a moment she just looked at him with an expression he'd come to recognize over the past 2 months as one of her real ones. The face she made when she'd stopped calculating and was just feeling something directly. "I've been thinking," she said. "That's not new. About what comes next." She turned the phone over in her hand, a habit he'd noticed, something she did when she was thinking past the current page. "The Bellwether campaign runs itself for the next 2 years. The team knows the playbook. You could run the operational side in your sleep, honestly. You've been the actual engine of this agency since before I'd admit it." She paused. "I've been thinking about stepping back from daily operations." Nathan watched her. "Stepping back to what?" "Something I've been building quietly for about 8 months. She looked up at him. "A creative investment company. Small. Focused on funding early-stage creative and media businesses that need capital but don't want to lose their voice to a corporate parent. Not an agency, not a holding company. Something different." "You've been building this for 8 months, Nathan said slowly. "Since before New York, before any of this." She made a small gesture between them. "I didn't tell you because it wasn't ready, and also because it felt personal, in a way the agency doesn't. The agency was my father's. This would be mine." The weight of that settled in the room. Nathan understood what it meant, what she was actually saying underneath the business language. Not just a career pivot, but a decision to stop running a thing that had always been partly a monument to someone else and start building something that was entirely her own. "What does the company look like?" he said. "Small, 15 people maximum, at least at first. The model is simple. We identify creative founders who have something real, and we give them capital without taking creative control. We take an equity stake, but we don't take a seat at the table unless they want us there." She paused. "I want you involved. Not as an employee, as a partner. Equal stake, equal voice on investment decisions. Your strategic instincts are better than mine on the creative side, and you know how to talk to founders in a way that doesn't make them feel like they're being acquired." Nathan was quiet for a moment. Outside his office, the floor was running on bellwether momentum. The particular buzz of a team that had just seen months of work land exactly where they'd aimed it, and he could hear it even through the closed door. That specific frequency of professional joy that only happened when something you'd built actually worked. "You're serious," he said. "I'm always serious." "Victoria, you're asking me to leave this company and start a new one with you." "I'm asking you to build something instead of just running it," she said. "There's a difference. You know there's a difference. You've known since the day I hired you that strategy direction wasn't the ceiling for you. It was just the floor you'd gotten comfortable standing on." She met his eyes directly. the way she did when she wanted him to hear her without the professional layer over it. You are better than this job. And I don't mean that as a criticism of the job. Nathan leaned back in his chair, looking at the ceiling the way he'd looked at the ceiling of his apartment the night this whole thing started, the night after the conference room blow-up that had cracked everything open. Except the ceiling he was looking at now felt different from the one he'd looked at then. It felt like a ceiling that had something on the other side of it. I need to think about it, he said. Take the week. I don't need the week. I need 2 days. Take the 2 days, Victoria said, and stood up, smoothing her blazer with both hands, collecting herself back into the shape of the person the rest of the floor knew. But at the door she stopped, the way she'd been stopping at doors since that very first week, always with something left to say that she'd almost decided against. For what it's worth, she said, the thing I'm most excited about isn't the business model. It's working next to you without anyone getting to have an opinion about whether we should. Nathan smiled. We'd still argue. Constantly, she said, about everything that matters. That's the part I'm counting on. She left, and Nathan sat in the quiet of his office for a long time, not working, just thinking. About the 2.5 years between walking into this company and this particular Tuesday in March, about the strange curved path that had gone from a conference room argument about font sizes to a hotel lobby in Manhattan to a signed contract to a morning in early spring when everything he'd worked toward had arrived at once and somehow left room for something more. He thought about Emma. He always thought about Emma. That evening, he picked her up from after-school care 20 minutes early, which was unusual enough that Emma immediately identified it as significant. She climbed into the back seat with her backpack half unzipped and her sneakers untied the way she always arrived, and looked at him through the rearview mirror with the particular suspicion of a 6-year-old who understood that pattern breaks meant information. "Why are you early?" she asked. "Because I wanted to talk to you about something." "Good something or bad something?" "Good something, I think. Maybe you tell me." They ended up at the park near the apartment, the one with the big oak tree Emma had been trying to climb for 2 years and was approximately 6 inches of arm span away from successfully reaching the first branch. She sat on the swing, not swinging, feet planted flat on the ground, giving him her full attention in the way she rarely gave anyone full attention unless it was a documentary about marine life. Nathan sat on the next swing over, which was comically small for him and always had been, and looked at his daughter and tried to figure out how to talk to a 6-year-old about a 30-year-old billionaire who had looked up dolphin olfactory systems because of a passing comment, and who was, Nathan had known for some time now, even if he hadn't said it out loud to anyone, the person he was in love with. "You know Victoria?" he started. Emma nodded. "Your work person." "She's not just my work person anymore. We're together, like the way grown-ups are together." He braced for the full range of possible responses, having consulted approximately nothing useful on the subject of explaining adult relationships to kindergartners, because there was no useful resource for that, only intuition and the specific knowledge of your specific child. Emma considered this for a long moment, feet still flat on the ground, face doing the focused thing it did when she was genuinely processing rather than performing thought. "Like Dana and her boyfriend? Kind of like that? Does she know about me?" "She knows everything about you. She knows you're interested in marine biology and that you think certain dolphins are bad decision makers." Emma's eyebrows went up. "I told you that." "I know. I might have mentioned it." "Did she look it up?" Nathan paused. "She did, actually." Emma looked at him with an expression he couldn't immediately categorize. "Can dolphins smell?" "Poorly. Their olfactory systems are limited compared to land mammals, but they can detect chemical signals in the water." Emma was quiet. Then, "That's actually really interesting." "Victoria thought you'd think so." Another long pause, the oak tree casting late afternoon shadows across the empty swing set. The city noise a distant layer beneath the particular quiet of a dad and his daughter working through something important on a Tuesday. "Is she nice?" Emma asked finally, which was the only question that had ever actually mattered. "She tries to be," Nathan said honestly. "She's still learning some of it, but she tries hard at the things she tries at." Emma seemed to accept this as reasonable. She started swinging, slowly, the way she did when she was done with the heavy part of a conversation and was ready to move on to the next thing. "Can I meet her?" "When you're ready." "I'm ready now." Nathan blinked. Now? "I want to ask her about the dolphins." Besan. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning that was finally, definitely spring, the kind with actual warmth in it, the harbor glittering instead of sitting flat, Victoria Ashcroft stood in the kitchen of Nathan's Charlestown apartment, holding a spatula she'd been handed without warning and staring at a pancake that had been in the pan approximately 30 seconds too long. "It's burning," Emma said from the counter stool, with the tone of a child who was informing, not criticizing. "I see that," Victoria said. "You have to watch it the whole time. You can't look away." "I didn't look away." "You looked at your phone." Victoria set the spatula down on the spoon rest with the particular precision of a woman who was managing her reaction to being corrected about pancake technique by a 6-year-old, and picked it back up again to flip the pancake, which was salvageable on one side if not the other. Nathan, who was leaning against the counter 3 feet away pretending to look at the weekend section of something on his tablet, was enjoying this enormously and had the good sense not to show it. "The brown part is still good," Emma said, pragmatically. "It just looks different." "Different," Victoria repeated. "Not ruined." "Daddy burns them sometimes too. He says it's caramelized." "That's exactly what it is," Nathan said, not looking up. "Caramelized." Victoria looked at him with an expression that was trying very hard to be withering and kept slipping sideways into something warmer. She plated the pancake, set it in front of Emma, and stood back. And Nathan watched his daughter pour an amount of syrup that was probably inadvisable and take a bite of the slightly overdone edge piece first, the way she always did. Emma chewed, considered. "It's good," she said. "The edge is crunchy." "It's supposed to be crunchy," Victoria said. "No, it isn't," Emma said without malice. "But it's still good." Nathan set the tablet down and came around the counter. Victoria was pouring batter for the next one, watching the pan this time, her focus the same absolute concentration she brought to quarterly reports and contract negotiations, applied now to the problem of not burning a second pancake in front of a 6-year-old who had already caught her once. He stood beside her at the stove, close, their shoulders almost touching, and said quietly, "You're doing fine." "I burned the pancake. Emma doesn't care. I care." "I know you do," he said. "That's the part that matters." Victoria was quiet for a moment, watching the batter bubble at the edges the way it did before it was ready to flip. Then, just low enough that Emma couldn't hear from the counter, "She told me about the starfish on the way back from the park last week." "Starfish?" "Apparently they are very misunderstood. She spent 11 minutes on it." A pause. "I looked up starfish." Nathan turned to look at her profile, the one he'd memorized in conference rooms over 2 years without knowing he was doing it. "Of course you did." "They don't actually have brains," Victoria said. "No centralized nervous system. They process everything in a distributed way through their entire body." She flipped the pancake, clean and correctly timed. Emma thought that was sad. "I thought it sounded practical." Nathan laughed, soft enough to stay just between them. "You're going to have very interesting arguments when she's older." "I'm counting on it," Victoria said, and the way she said it, present tense, forward-looking, including herself in the future as a given rather than a hope, was the thing that landed in Nathan's chest and stayed. The hardest moment came in April, not from the office or the board or the press, but from a Saturday afternoon when Emma's mother called. It happened without warning, the way those things always did. Nathan's phone lit up with a number he hadn't deleted but hadn't called in 3 years, and he stepped out onto the fire escape to take it because Emma was in the living room and he was not going to have that conversation where his daughter could hear it. Her name was Claire, and she sounded the same as she always had. Warm in the first 10 seconds, then underneath the warmth, the particular tension of someone who knew they owed a debt they weren't planning to pay. She'd seen something online, she said, a piece in a trade publication about the Bellwether campaign. Nathan's name was in it. She'd clicked through, found more, read about Victoria Ashcroft. "She owns the company?" Claire said. "She does." "And you're together?" "Yes." A pause. I'm not trying to interfere. I just wanted to... Emma. She stopped, tried again. Is Emma okay with it? Nathan stood on the fire escape in the April cold, looking out over the Charlestown rooftops, and the anger that had lived in him for 4 years since Claire had walked out was still there. He wasn't going to pretend it wasn't, but it was smaller now, less corrosive, the way things get when your life fills up enough that the empty spaces left by old wounds close over from the outside in. Emma is great, he said. Emma has been great. She's been great because I've been here. Nathan, I'm not saying it to hurt you. I'm saying it because it's true. And because if you're calling to ask about her, you should know what you're actually asking about. She's 6. She's sharp and she's kind and she has strong opinions about marine biology and superheroes. She's healthy and she's happy and she's surrounded by people who aren't going anywhere. Silence on the other end, longer than the previous one. I'm glad, Claire said finally, and it sounded like she meant it, which somehow made it both easier and harder. I'm glad you found someone. Goodbye, Claire, Nathan said, not cruelly. He stood on the fire escape a few more minutes after the call, letting the cold air do its work, letting the old feeling run through him and out the other end the way feelings did when you stop trying to hold them still. Then he went back inside, where Emma was lying on the living room floor surrounded by coloring books and had apparently decided that the carpet was a better surface for her current project than the table. Who was on the phone? She asked, without looking up. Someone from a long time ago, Nathan said, which was true and complete and all she needed. You want to call Victoria? She said she had a book about marine biology she was going to bring over. Emma looked up at that, full attention engaged. The one with the deep sea chapter? I think so. Call her now, Emma said, with the urgency of a person to whom time was always somewhat precious. Nathan called Victoria, who answered on the second ring, who did in fact have the marine biology book, and arrived an hour later with it and a bag of groceries for dinner because she'd decided on the drive over that she was going to try making pasta and was not going to burn it, which turned out to be mostly true with only one minor incident involving an inadequately watched pot and a smoke alarm that Emma found extremely exciting. Dinner was imperfect in the specific way that dinner is imperfect in small apartments with 6-year-olds. Noodles slightly overcooked, Emma's opinions about the sauce expressed with complete honesty, a glass of water tipped over and caught just before it reached Victoria's phone, an argument about whether the documentary channel took precedence over the nature channel that was resolved by giving Emma the remote and accepting the consequences. Victoria sat on Nathan's couch afterward, Emma asleep against her side. It had happened gradually, the kid shifting closer during the documentary, and Victoria had gone very still when it happened, like sudden movement might break something, and then slowly, carefully, put her arm around the small person leaning into her, and looked at Nathan across the living room with an expression he had never once, not in 2.5 years of knowing her, seen on her face. She fell asleep on me, Victoria said very quietly, like she was reporting something that had happened to someone else, and she was still processing the implications. She does that, Nathan said, equally quiet. She's heavy. I know. Her elbow is in my side. I can move her. Don't, Victoria said immediately, before the words were even fully out of his mouth. Don't move her. Nathan looked at the two of them on his couch, his daughter and the woman who had looked up dolphin olfactory biology and starfish neurology and marine ecology books because a 6-year-old had mentioned them in passing, who had burned a pancake and been corrected about it and tried again, who was now sitting perfectly still with Emma's full weight against her side because she didn't want to disturb her, and felt the 4-letter word he'd been carrying quietly for months rise up through him with enough force that he almost said it right then, in the middle of his own living room, over the low sound of a nature documentary and his daughter's breathing. He waited. Victoria looked at him across the room, something in her face he recognized now as the real version, the one underneath the CEO, and the billionaire and the impossible standards, the one that had been there all along and had just needed somewhere safe to land. I think I understand it now, she said softly. Understand what? What you meant, when you said you forgot to be anything but her dad. She looked down at Emma's sleeping face, so close to her shoulder. I used to think that sounded like losing yourself, like giving yourself up. But that's not what it is it? No, Nathan said. It's not. It's the opposite, Victoria said, like she was working it out as she said it. You find out what you actually are by being that specific thing for someone who needs it. A pause. I never had that. Anyone to be that for. I thought I didn't need it. And now? She looked up at him. Now I think I had it backwards for a long time. Jawasan. The investment company launched in June under the name Groundwork Creative Partners, which was Victoria's name, chosen because she'd wanted to be an architect once and had never stopped thinking about what it meant to build foundations for things that lasted. The office was smaller than anything Victoria had run in 10 years. 12 people in a converted row house in the South End, high ceilings and exposed brick, and a conference table that had been custom-built by a furniture maker in New Hampshire, who was, as it happened, one of their first investment clients. Nathan's official title was co-founder and chief investment officer, which looked good on paper and meant approximately what it said, but also meant something that didn't have a title. The person who walked through a founder's pitch deck and found the emotional truth buried under the financial projections. The person who sat across from a 28-year-old trying to build a media company on borrowed time and said, "Tell me why this matters to you," instead of "walk me through the unit economics." Who understood that the best creative businesses usually had a why that preceded the what by years. They were good at it in a way that was different from how they'd been good at Ashcroft Media. At the agency, they'd been good together because they'd canceled out each other's blind spots while competing to be right. At Groundwork, they were good together because they'd stopped competing. The arguing still happened, weekly, sometimes daily, often over things that seemed minor and turned out not to be. But it had a different quality now, less armor in it, more actual search for the right answer rather than the performance of being the person who had it first. Priya left Ashcroft Media 4 months after they did and came to Groundwork as head of creative strategy, which surprised nobody who had paid attention. Gerald Morrow sent Nathan a handwritten note when the firm launched, brief and genuine, something about respecting the way they'd handled it. Thomas Aldridge sent nothing, which was itself a message and a clean one. Marcus, who had remained at Ashcroft Media under the new operational head Victoria had hired to replace herself, texted Victoria the first week after she left. The blue in the new campaign materials is wrong, 2 degrees too corporate. I think you should know this. Victoria sent the text to Nathan. Nathan sent back a single laughing emoji and nothing else, which she screenshot and looked at 3 times over the course of the day. The evening Nathan finally said it out loud arrived the way those evenings always arrive. Without announcement, in the middle of something ordinary, when the stakes were low enough that the truth could come through without having to fight anything on its way out. It was August. Hot by Boston standards, the city doing its best impression of a place that knew what summer felt like. Emma was at Dana's for the weekend, the first full weekend Nathan had been without her in longer than he could remember, which felt both like freedom and like walking around with something missing from his coat pocket. He and Victoria had dinner at a restaurant in the North End that had tiny tables and candles and wine bottles and pasta. So good that even Victoria, who had opinions about pasta after the failed home experiment, ate it without comment. They walked afterward along the harbor. No destination, the way you walk when there's nowhere you have to be, and you're in no hurry to stop being where you are. Victoria was talking about one of their portfolio founders, a woman named Jess, who was building a documentary production company and who had the particular combination of vision and stubbornness that Nathan and Victoria both recognized in each other and found simultaneously inspiring and exhausting. "She reminds me of you," Nathan said. "She's 24. She reminds me of you at 24, probably. I was insufferable at 24. You're still occasionally insufferable," Nathan said. That's not a criticism. I've become very fluent in it. Victoria looked at him sideways, the light from the harbor catching the side of her face, the small scar near her eyebrow that he knew the location of now the way he knew the location of everything about her, not deliberately catalogued, just absorbed over time by proximity and attention. "You have become very fluent in it," she said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite the casual comment it was dressed as. "I love you," Nathan said. He didn't plan it. It came out the way the true things had been coming out since a Tuesday in a conference room almost a year ago. Ahead of the decision to say them, The honest part of him always slightly faster than the cautious part. Victoria stopped walking. They were on the harbor walk, the water on their left, the city lights on their right, and she stopped and turned to look at him with the expression he recognized now as the one that meant something had reached her past all the architecture she'd built to keep things from reaching her. "Say that again," she said, and the echo of it, say it again, the same thing she'd asked in New York, in a conference room when he'd told her he'd been looking for her in every room, landed between them like a stone in still water. "I love you," Nathan said, "not because this has been easy. It hasn't been easy. Not because you're uncomplicated, because Victoria, you are the most complicated person I have ever been close to, and I mean that sincerely. Because of all of it. Because you look up dolphin biology for my daughter. Because you stood in a conference room in Manhattan and told me you were afraid and told me anyway. Because you built something new instead of running the old thing forever because it was safe. Because I have spent almost 3 years watching you work at being the version of yourself you want to be, instead of just the version that was handed to you, and I think that is one of the bravest things I've ever seen." Victoria looked at him for a long moment. The harbor moved behind her, patient, indifferent, doing what water always did, regardless of what people were saying to each other nearby. "I love you," she said, and the way she said it was different from the way he'd expected her to say it, if he'd thought about it, which he had. It wasn't measured, wasn't delivered with the boardroom precision. It was just plain, clean, the way she spoke when she'd stopped trying to manage how it landed. "I love Emma. I love the life you've built in that small apartment in Charlestown that is inexplicably covered in unicorn stickers. I love that you argued with me in front of the entire strategy floor for 2 years and never once let me get away with being less than what I was capable of." A pause. "I love that you said the wrong thing in a meeting and refused to let me pretend it hadn't happened. I love that you said 4 words back that changed everything," Nathan said. "You already do," Victoria said, and smiled. The full one, the rare one, the one that changed the whole geometry of her face. "I meant it then. I just didn't know how much yet." Nathan reached up and pushed the strand of hair back from her face, the gesture that had become theirs without being decided on. The small private language of 2 people who'd spent long enough paying attention to each other that they'd started building a vocabulary without realizing it. They stood there by the water a while longer, not in a hurry to go anywhere, both of them carrying the specific weight of a year that had asked a great deal of them, had asked them to be honest when hiding was easier, to be patient when pushing was more natural, to let something real grow in the middle of conditions that were not particularly designed for it. And both of them finding that the weight had become, over time, something they didn't want to put down. That was the thing nobody told you, Nathan thought, watching the harbor lights move on the water. They told you love was supposed to feel like relief, like setting something down, like finally resting. And sometimes it was. But the better version of it, the kind that lasted, the kind that was actually worth the complicated middle part, felt more like arriving somewhere and finding out you had energy you didn't know you had, because the place you'd arrived at made you want to keep building. He thought about Emma, who would have opinions about everything that happened next, who would negotiate bedtimes and documentary rights, and whether the kitchen pancake technique met acceptable standards. He thought about Dana, who had said just be careful in the particular voice of someone who loved him enough to let him be imperfect about it. He thought about Priya at the desk down the hall from his at Groundwork, who had said, "You're less tense with the accuracy of someone who had been watching him carry something for years." He thought about a conference room in Boston, a Tuesday in March 2 years ago. A man who said the wrong thing, and a woman who said 4 words back, neither of them knowing that they'd just cracked something open that wasn't going to close again. Some stories started with the right thing, said perfectly, at exactly the right moment. This one had started with the wrong thing, said badly, with a room full of witnesses and no plan at all. And it had turned out, against all reasonable odds, to be exactly the beginning it needed to be. Not because anything had been easy, because nothing worth building ever was. Because the 2 people doing the building had been stubborn enough and honest enough, and just scared enough to keep going anyway, past the professional walls and the old wounds and the reasonable arguments for keeping their distance, until they'd gotten somewhere neither of them had been before. Somewhere that felt, for the first time in a long time, like home.